Hi, welcome to our next next session, and the topic is gender approaches, or also referred to as um, frameworks, but sometimes also dubbed as paradigms to development. Yes, so our objective is to explore the approaches to gender and development, and those will include women in development, women and development, and gender and development. So let's begin. But before we go any further, I just wanted us to remind ourselves about the key concepts we're dealing with here. One of them is gender, and we are looking at those distinct attributes that are socially constructed regarding the roles, the responsibilities, the relationships, the relations, and of course opportunities between men and women, boys and girls. So we all have that thing that is expected of us based on our gender by our communities and our families, but also other agents of socialization, including schools, workplaces, the state itself, market, and our families. Another reminder on the concepts has to do with the gender relations. So if we say that gender looks at the distinct or differences between men and women in terms of relations, so we need to know what relations are. And in this case, we are saying that they are we mean the relations of power and dominance within a particular structure of life. And of course, it has to do with issues of decision making, access and control, ownership of resources, benefits, and opportunities. Regardless of whether whether one has earned it through achievement or through ascription, such as inheritance. Then we look at gender equality. We are talking about equal enjoyment of all opportunities, services, goods. If there is education, do both men and women attain that equally? If it is access to health services, who is disadvantaged and who benefits more? So we look at issues of having situations where there are no discriminations on the grounds of one's gender or sex. So gender equality does not mean that men and women have to become the same. No way. That's not what we are saying. But we are rather saying that their opportunities and life chances should be equal. So it is as simple as that. Then there is another reminder about gender inequalities. These are the differences between men and women that systematically empower one group to the detriment of the other. And of course, where there is low levels of equality, there is high levels of inequalities. Where there is high levels of inequalities, there are low levels of equality. It just goes like that. So I brought these reminders because all development approaches or development and gender approaches are designed to deal with such. They are designed to reduce inequalities while they promote equality between men and women, boys and girls. So therefore, the approaches are designed to reduce gender inequalities and promote development, benefit both men and women, uh, boys and girls. And we have the three of them: women involvement, women and development, and gender involvement. And we're going to explain this in a moment. So we just need to look at the genesis of how did this come up and why and when did this come up. So in early 50s, if you may also remember your theories of development, modernization, dependency, and the rest, these approaches are somehow connected to those theories. So in 1950s, the assumption was that the benefits of economic growth would trickle down to families. But of course, we know that by then, even now, um, trying to create an intervention to benefit a full household does not put into account of the gender relations at play, the intra-household or inter-household decision-making processes or relations. So in 1950s, that was the assumption that, oh, okay, if the country grows economically, then through the GDP and the benefits of GDP, if they trickle down, they go to the households, and therefore the households would be benefiting. But of course, there was a realization that, oh, wait, it is men who are actually benefiting a lot from such development, if indeed, if it does trickle down as assumed. Then in 1950s and 60s, interventions were now using a welfare approach of providing handouts and other kinds of welfare, such as services, even food, handouts in terms of food or other items that would help households to grow, or especially women. But they did not challenge the women's status or patriarchal structures. So they were only concentrating on improving economic growth rather than looking at those challenges that bring about inequalities at households and individual level, even within communities. So in 1970s, there was then a realization that women were neglected and they were actually missing out in development, that they were, and yet they would have been key players in contributing to economic growth in that case. So followed by a comprehensive recognition that women were being regarded as passive recipients, not as actual objects or participants of development. Then this gave birth to the WID framework, which focused mainly on integrating women in development processes. So let's look at WID. So WID is Women in Development, and it evolved in early 70s, in 1970s, from a liberal feminist framework, particularly influential in North America, of course. This was a reaction to women as being passive beneficiaries of development, because mostly it is men who were working, and therefore men would be the providers and women would stay home and do whatever they had to do to be able to do to fulfill the traditional roles, mainly reproductive roles, that they are supposed to be doing as key members of the households. And of course, so women in WID recognized that recognize the distinct needs and capacities of women, and therefore that women could actually be part of, contribute to the economic development or development processes, but also benefit somehow, rather than only receiving development benefits through their husbands. So the women's problem here was recognized as insufficient participation in development, which was also not actually doing well. So bringing in women would also contribute to development processes. So, of course, women's subordination was seen as exclusion from the market sphere and limited access to and control over resources. So the whole idea of integrating women is that you integrate them, they can be able to have some kind of access to and control over resources, but also participate in the marketplace, and that would eventually lead to them achieving some kinds of needs or attaining particular needs or fulfilling some of their interests, but also contribute entirely to the development process, which would later collectively benefit everyone. So, um, an important corrective action was needed. So women needed to be integrated in development processes as active agents rather than just passive participants. That is, if development was to effectively be attained. So, making women's significant productive contribution visible, but one issue is here that the women's while WID was concentrating on integrating women in development processes, the reproductive roles were being underplayed in a way that in one way women would be adding on the roles they do at home, because the patriarchal society already had defined what they should be doing. So bringing in such an intervention that adds another kind of role to women enlarges the burden. That's what we look at as the triple role burden. When we were looking at the first session first session slides where you're defining concepts and the rest. Okay, so it is very key that one looks at that. Yeah, so the weed would in this case seem to be helping and addressing the practical gender needs, and at a later stage we are going to look at the what practical gender needs in some details. But in this case there are those immediate needs that helps one to be able to do what they are supposed to do as a gender. Okay, so for example, creating employment and income generating opportunities, improving access to credit and education, or income that they would use, for instance, to buy food and the rest. So the WID was implemented using different policy approaches, including welfare, equity, and poverty efficiency and empowerment. I'm not going to go through these in details, but I've provided here where you can read them in details for your own benefit. Now, as an intervention, we'd had weaknesses, and therefore that put it at the forefront for, of course, for criticism, which is also okay because criticisms help to uh, to, 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 to to create better changes. So one of the problem with WID was that it focuses on women alone. Focusing on women alone means that you are ignoring why they are in the position they are, and that means you maintain that particular position. So you are, in that case, you are concentrating on addressing the symptoms rather than addressing the root causes of the problem. There was no consideration of the root causes of why women are ignored. There's inequalities were ignored. Inequalities that make women disadvantaged were ignored, and of course, the assumption that all women were homogeneous was wrong, because there are women who were doing much better, especially those that were living in elite families or elite households, or who were better in the upper classes, middle or upper classes. Those wouldn't be at the same position as those in the lower classes. Okay, so also not considering the reproductive roles of women would be a problem, because that's what I just said, increasing the burden on them. Okay, so a focus on women, not gender, would then lead to criticism that would give birth to another approach, which is WID, women and development. Now, one thing is that to note is that WID does not come up with more announced better strategies, but it does more of critiquing women and development. So, I mean, women involvement, that is WID. So, what focuses on the relationship between men and women and the development process. So, it does a critical analysis of that to identify more challenges faced by women and men in the development processes. So, it recognizes that although WID was concentrating on women to be facing challenges, WID also looks at the dichotomy of stratification of society, looking at upper, middle, and lower classes, and then therefore focuses its analysis showing that, wait, why are we concentrating on women alone? And yet, even in developing countries within the international frame, those men are also disadvantaged and affected by structures of inequalities, because there are women who were also much better than other men. So it critiqued women in development, that it emphasizes on the integration of women, yet they have always been involved but not recognized, yes, in that case, because we are participating in farming and the rest. So it's just that their contributions were not being recognized, but they have been part of the development processes. So what criticizes that WID still lie at the lower level of the dichotomy, and therefore it was only reinforcing gender inequalities than solving the problems. And of course, that's what I just said, that WID gives little analytical attention to the social relations, which then WID was now trying to analyze. So I already also said that WID was without more advanced ideologies on how women should be considered in development processes, but it just gave a main critique to WID, which then makes WID as a bridging gap between WID and GAD, which is gender and development. Okay, so gender and development imagine focusing on feminist theories. Of course, we are going to look at feminist theories in the next session, in another session for that case. And it is a result of frustration with the lack of progress with WID. So by 1980s, there was recognition that WID was not going anywhere with improving women's wealth, women's statuses and challenging the inequalities, and therefore GAD was adopted as a new approach to address such inequalities. And of course, so therefore it sees women's real problems as the imbalance of power between men and women rather than just mere missing integration of women involvement processes. And therefore GAD focuses on the socially constructed basis uh, of differences between men and women, and looking at how it can challenge those distinctions that we looked at in the definitions of gender, those distinctions that do with relations, responsibilities, opportunities, and access to and control and ownership of resources. Yeah, so GAD looks at how they can improve, remove those obstacles to be able to create a conducive environment for women to achieve their own needs and aspirations. Remember in the previous session, and paradigm shifts from economic growth to human development, we are looking at ability of actors to expand choices and freedoms so that every individual can choose what they can be or do. So that's what we're looking at here. If we factor in that kind of development into the gender perspective we're looking at here. Okay. So focus is on, as you can see, the dimensions of development here: social, economic, political, and cultural forces that influence inequalities. So removing those obstacles would then create that kind of environment where freedoms are expanded for even women to benefit equally as men. So, GAD questions the relations between men and women, and of course, their roles that have been ascribed to them within their societies, and looks at the idea that the gender division of labor between men and women could be is actually the root cause of the inequality. So if we address those root causes, then we would be able to address to address the problems and challenges faced by women as a gender that is always dominated by men. So patriarchy is a root problem, looking at why and how male dominance is maintained. So if we remove that kind of hegemonic dominance, it would help to remove the obstacles that women face. So therefore, GAD seeks to promote women's freedom to attain potential, to develop themselves and society collectively, seeks to empower and promote women through their own efforts. So having them participate, but also take decisions, but also making sure they determine what they want to be or want to do. And of course, it aims at meeting both practical gender needs and more strategic gender needs. And in a moment, we shall look at the gender needs in the next slide. So this is those are the distinctions, or that's the shift from women involvement towards women and development, and then gender and development. So you can see a shift from just focusing on women integration towards looking at both the root causes that bring about the inequalities. So if we understand the root causes, then in that case we'll be able to devise strategies that can empower both genders to equally benefit from development processes. So what are gender needs? We're saying that shared and prioritized needs identified by women and also men that arise from their common experiences as gender. So if you are a woman, what do you experience as your need? If you're a man, what do you experience as your need within a particular society? Okay, and what are those obstacles that actually uh, limit you from achieving such needs? Those are the obstacles that these other approaches, such as gender development, look at addressing. Okay, so the identifies the ways in which women's gender interests defined by themselves can be satisfied in the planning process, because to be able to plan well we need to know what we are addressing, and to know what we are addressing we need to find out from the actual people who are experiencing such problems or needs. Okay, so needs and interests definitely come out of those roles that have been given by men and women. If you say a man must provide for a house, or a house, or for his households, what do they need to be able to achieve that particular need? They need to have a job and work, get income, and therefore they can be able to provide for the house. If you say women need to prepare food and make sure there is food on the table, what do they need? They need food. So how do they get food? Or if women, they say they need to be educated to do catering very well, so what is needed? They need training. So those are kind of the needs that we're talking about when we say, okay, those things that women and men, boys and girls need or require to be able to perform the roles they are supposed to do as individuals or collectively within particular society. So two categories of gender needs according to Moza 1989. I have provided this document. You should be able to look through it and benefit from it entirely. This is just a presentation, so just go and visit it for further details. So we have practical gender needs and strategic gender needs. So let's take a look at the explanations of each. Practical gender needs, very short-term needs, and they're immediate. Immediate in a way that you just need them to do the actual role that you have been given. Okay, a woman to be able to cook, they need saucepan. I mean, they need pots or pans or forks or plates in the kitchen to be able to do catering very well. So they are immediate. If a man requires to a man has to provide for the household, then they need those resources such as land to be able to uh, uh, work out how they can provide for the household. Okay, or if it's within the hunting and gathering society, then the man needs a spear and a panga they can use to go and hunt. Then they can provide for the household. So they are short-term need, those that you need there and then to be able to live. Okay, think of them as the basic needs. Okay, you need shelter, you need the house, you need. Okay, so needs identified by women that if met would assist their survival in their socially accepted roles within existing power. Example, you have your housing, food, water, and the rest. So practical gender needs do not directly challenge gender inequalities, because you need them to do the roles that have been given to you, but not challenge those roles. Strategic gender needs are long-term needs, those that can be planned for one to achieve them, but also to change the status quo. Needs that, if met, would enable women to transform existing imbalances of power. Okay, and such those include power and control, legal rights. Okay, legal rights could help you to also own particular resources, which means ownership gives you full access and control. Yeah, equal wages such as those of men, control over their own bodies. So issues of having justice for to reduce abuses or violence against women, access to credit and microfinance information, of course, or also having rights to uh, property rights, because property rights would therefore guarantee that you can use such property to access credit and information. So, strategic gender needs require strategies that look at challenging those privileges that men have been having in a patriarchal society, so that they can help women to be better. So, however, one thing is, yes, as much as we can distinguish between practical gender needs and strategic gender needs, in reality, the situation is different and uh, sometimes discouraging and challenging. So, because it is difficult to distinguish clearly practical gender needs and strategic gender needs, because any intervention can help in meeting such. If you start up a circle for women to give them money, women would use money to buy things they want to use in the kitchen, but they would also use it to, for instance, to educate themselves. So such an intervention, it is difficult to distinguish, to say that okay, this intervention is basically meant for attaining strategic gender needs, uh, not practical gender needs, or this is meant for practical gender needs, not strategic gender needs. So it's difficult to distinguish what a certain intervention can help to achieve. And of course, when strategic gender needs are threatening attainment of practical gender needs, you might see that some kind of resistance from women concerning if you want to empower them to attain strategic gender needs. Take an example. Our Uganda, there is a debate or a bill that has been in the Ugandan parliament for some decades or years or so. The MAD bill, I call it the MAD bill, or the marriage and divorce bill. Um, the reason why it is still becoming a problem is the experts themselves or the legislators themselves who debate about it are concerned that the bill threatens black gender needs, but also women themselves. You remember when they said they were going to consult the public about it. So when they were consulting, the MPs were consulting, some women came out and said, okay, this bill is going to destroy our marriages because it is going to take away this and this, and therefore we might not get married because our men would not want us to own property. So such that is some kind of threat. Those are the threats I'm talking about. That where individuals see that women, even though interventions are meant to promote gender equality and reduce on obstacles that women are facing, some interventions would feel threatening situations that women would rather consider living as they are than going ahead to achieve the strategic gender needs. So I just provided similarities here for WID and GAD, and some of these I've already been talking about them. That interventions can help in achieving both. So all approaches have contributed to both women's and men's welfare. and that is the reality. That's what happens. And they all contribute to development since they focus on transforming social relations and structures. So those could be some of the similarities, but of course I have made here a summary of what we've already talked about, but this distinction is only between WID and GAD, since women and development, that is WID, did not uh, introduce new ones. So in terms of approach, WID seeks to integrate women in development, while GAD seeks to empower women and transforming unequal relations. The focus for WID is only on women, but the focus for GAD is on both men and women and also their relations. For WID, the problem is that women were excluded from development process. But for GAD, the problem is patriarchy, which gives men some dominance, and that comes with unequal relations of power and uh, of power, which sometimes disadvantages women. So the goal in that case would be that GAD, while WID looks at more if achieving an efficient and effective development process, but also bringing women as instruments in development. For GAD, it is about the goal is about both men and women making sure that they share decision making and power, but also promoting equitable and sustainable development for both men and women. So therefore, the strategy for WID is to increase women's ability to manage development and their lives and their, livelihoods in households, increase women's productivity and income, and also implement women's components and projects within the development process. But for GAD, it is about identifying and addressing both strategic gender needs, both short and long term needs, and also identifying and addressing women's and men's long term interests. And that qualifies them to be both practical and gender needs for GAD, but women in development is more focusing on practical gender needs alone. So, what is the bottom line? The bottom line is that WID and GAD uh, are theoretically distinct, but in practice they are less clear to dissociate. Okay, so it is very important that you note that. That is why you'll find some NGOs or development actors establishing particular policies that are aiming at bringing gender equality, but at the end of the day they are actually addressing only practical gender needs, which takes us back to the WID approach rather than gender. So development agents commit to GAD, but practice remains WID. And of course, sometimes in most cases you'll find that theoretically the agency is trying to create an intervention or implement an intervention which on paper is basically gender and development. But when it comes to implementation, the things are not quite the same. So and some of those are actually brought about by the idea that gender sometimes is mistakenly interpreted as women, and therefore shifting uh, GAD on paper to WID in implementation. So putting words in action is a problem, but of course that can't stop actors from trying. Okay. So I have provided a simple case here, and I've extracted it from Techman 2012 Participatory Development Training Manual, the Future Together project, on page 41 and page 42, where you have an NGO that did try to to put up pipes to help women to reduce on their long routes to the water sources. But of course, if you read through, you will see that uh, it had some issues to do with gender analysis, some issues to do with identifying the real needs or the actual needs that women needed. So, and some issues in terms of implementation, and some issues to do with what approach was used. So I've given you some of the questions here. You can read through the the slides that we've just covered, and then you see whether WID or GAD applies to this case, and then you see why you think so, and of course think about why what should have been done better to help these women. Okay, so I've also given you a few discussion questions. If you want, you can explore them. I briefly explain the origins of WID, WAD, and GAD as frameworks used in regional development, identify the similarities and differences, and examine why there was a shift from WID to WAD and GAD. Very simple and straightforward. And as always, I have provided you with references that can help you out. Okay, so that marks the end of this presentation. Thank you.